Dead to Begin With by Jennifer Blackstream. Read by Matt Addis. Chapter 1. Draft a standard reminder to the dwarves in Angosta. The production levels specified in our contract are not being met. Tell them that if they continue to produce such meager amounts of gold, the contract will be forfeit and they will no longer have my protection from the goblins. Kirill paused in the center of the mine, ignoring the noise of pickaxes and huffing dwarves as he mentally tallied the amount of gold he'd received from Angosta in the past 3 months. Black dust billowed in clouds around him, coating his white-blonde hair until it appeared grey as he held the numbers in his head, comparing them with the most recent delivery. Tell them I expect an increase of at least 11% for the next month, or they can consider the contract void. Have a cancellation document ready to be sent out the day after the gold delivery, and tell the messenger to wait for my word. The small Kurdish at his side scribbled furiously, claws carefully curled in so as not to shred the parchment. A shovel full of dirt rained down on its bald head, tiny stones pinging off its small black horns, and it let out a high-pitched squeak and scrambled to brush the debris from its notes. Kirill slid his attention to the source of the mess, keen eyesight easily picking out the dwarf viciously digging his shovel into the side of the mine, burrowing for a particularly large chunk of diamond. "Sasha, do be careful where you're flinging that. Anisim's notes must still be legible upon our return to the castle." The dwarf holding the offending shovel paused, the newly freed diamond gripped in his grubby, thick-fingered hand. His brown eyes widened as he realized Kirill was addressing him by name, and he scuttled back a few steps. He nudged at his dirty red cap with the back of his hand clutching the diamond, and offered an awkward bow. "Yes, of course, Your Highness."
"Kirill, my husband, if a bit of dirt is so disconcerting to you, then might I suggest you take Anisim back to the castle and conduct your business there, instead of standing in the middle of the mine impeding Sasha's work?"
Irina's sweet voice slid over Kirill like a silken sheet, soothing him even as she once again contradicted him in front of his subordinates. He fixed a tolerant smile on his face as he faced his wife, careful as always not to flash his fangs at her. Irina stood in the middle of the cave, a vision in her deep crimson cloak lined with pale grey fox fur. The black velvet of her gown, where it showed between the part of her cloak, was caked in dirt, as was the bottom of the cloak. He idly wondered how long Irina had been strolling through the mines, talking with the dwarves this time. She did have the oddest fondness for the small-statured workers. "It is nearly the end of the month, my wife. You know as well as I do that the accounting must be done, not merely for this month, but for the entire year. Production levels have dropped around this time in the past, and it's important to make certain that this year does not see the same failing. I am trying to arrange an alliance with a dragon lord, and the dragons, as you well know, care for nothing but gold and precious jewels. If I am to manage this alliance, I must be here to make certain production remains where it should be." He slanted a glance at Sasha, who squeaked and immediately resumed digging another diamond from the rock. "For some reason, they work faster in my presence." Irina crossed her arms underneath her heavy cloak. Her raven-black hair slid across her shoulders as she fixed disapproving brown eyes on him.
"It's the eve of the winter solstice, my love. Tomorrow is Kolyda."
She jutted her chin out.
"Production levels be damned."
"Production levels have been damned. That's the problem." Kirill scanned the carts holding the diamonds the dwarves had gathered tonight so far, doing a few quick calculations in his head. Still behind. He returned his gaze to his wife. Frivolity has no place in the political world.
Politics have no place in the frivolous world,
Irina corrected him, dropping her arms to her sides and tilting her head at him. The hard edge faded from her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more like the tone she usually used with him.
And there is no day that should be more frivolous than Collider, which is precisely why you're going to take tomorrow off. I want us to have dinner with our friends. After all we've been through, I think it's time we all sat down and had a meal together. I want to get to know Loop, Ivy, Marcella, and Diana without interjecting comments like, I need more arrows, or I'll take the one on the right.
You never should have been involved in that battle in the first place. The words flew from his mouth before Kirill could stop them. Irina's body stilled, that instant tension that let him know he'd said something he was going to regret. He shoved away the sense of foreboding and straightened his spine. The others felt the same way. None of us were willing to risk our wives. If we had wanted your help in that battle, we would have asked you.
That sounds very much like a conversation we will be having later, when it's not the eve of the winter solstice,
Irina said softly.
But for now, I'll leave you with this. There are two ways we can be parted. My death or your destruction. You can prevent the first, since it seems to please you.
Her eyes flashed, the black orbs briefly swallowing the whites until her gaze consisted of two drowning black holes.
I will prevent the second.
As quickly as the mood had struck Irina, it vanished. Her Rusalka heritage faded from her vision, her eyes returning to their normal chocolate brown as she smiled at the dwarves around her.
And since you and I will be spending tomorrow entertaining our friends, there's no reason our people shouldn't enjoy the same holiday. Let Collider be a day off for everyone.
All activity in the mine ground to a halt. The dwarves froze. Thick iron pickaxes buried in the black rock, heavy shovels spilling dirt as they sagged to the ground. Even the Kurdush went still as a statue, beady black eyes popping out of his head, forked tail knotted behind him. Inch by painful inch, every gaze in the mine slid to the vampire prince, no one daring to breathe as his wife's announcement hung in the air. Switching mental gears from roiling thoughts of his wife endangering herself to admonishing her for facing off with him in public took a fair amount of concentration. Kirill took a moment to gather his patience, collect his thoughts. He had to remind himself that being short-tempered with his wife never ended well, and was a complete waste of resources. Better to remain calm and practical, the only cure for a woman's brashness. Irina, do you have any idea how beneficial an alliance with the dragons would be?
You have plenty of alliances as it is.
Irina's voice remained even, a perfect match for her husband's.
And the dragons will still be there in the new year. Tomorrow is Collider. People should be celebrating with their families, not slaving away in your mines so that you can bribe another race to be your political comrades.
Kirill stiffened, his temper sparking to life despite his best intentions. He stroked the dagger in his belt as he struggled to stay calm, the sleek perfection of the weapon a comfort to his fraying nerves. I will not sacrifice our future for the sake of a meaningless holiday. Feast and be merry if you like. I will be here, working. He met the eyes of each dwarf until one by one they looked away. As will all of them. Irina pursed her lips, eyes narrowing briefly. She took a deep breath, and the tension melted away, her shoulders easing and the lines in her face smoothing into its usual soft perfection. She swayed toward him, her footsteps light over the uneven ground of the mine, and Kirill couldn't help but appreciate the rhythmic back-and-forth motion of her hips. His blood heated as he anticipated the press of her body against his. It wasn't until he felt himself leaning forward that he realized what he was doing, and cursed himself for his weakness. His wife had Rusalka blood in her veins. He of all people should know to beware of her seductive approach to negotiation.
Kirill, I'm sorry. I know how hard you work to make sure our future is safe. I know that your strategizing and alliance contracts are all for our own benefit. I did not mean to dismiss them as unimportant. But in the same way that I understand how important alliances are for our future, you must understand how important our friends are. Etienne, Adonis, Patrizio, Samal. They are not merely your allies now, they are your friends. As are Loop, Ivy, Marcella, and Diana. They care about us, and we care about them.
Kirill steeled himself against the pleasing note in her voice, the vulnerability in her eyes. He would not be manipulated.
Irina
pointed a finger at him.
Don't try to tell me you don't care. I've seen you working with Adonis, taking him under your wing. I know he's your protégé. And don't think I didn't notice that you had your tailor draw up special designs for Patrizio for clothing that would fit around his wings, so he could wear something other than robes. You care.
She stepped even closer until he could feel the heat radiating from her body. It would have been undignified to dodge her embrace, and yet Kirill knew it would have been smarter than letting his wife loop her arms around his neck. The scent of cinnamon and apple swamped his senses, a light perfume over the even more pleasant aroma of her blood under her skin. He closed his eyes, resisting the urge to bury his face in her neck, despite the ache in his fangs urging him to do so. She pressed against him, the cold silk of her gown seeping through the velvet of his tunic, quickly overwhelmed by the heat of her life force throbbing against him. Memories of what her body felt like, naked against his own, flooded his mind, and he bit back a groan.
It's only one day,
Irina whispered, her lips a hair's breadth from his own.
Spend it with me? With our friends?
Kirill's temper died a pitiful death. He slid his hand away from the dagger under his cloak, abandoning it in favor of curling his arms around Irina's waist. A pleasant heat undulated through his veins, pulsing beneath his skin as if his body had a life of its own.
You would use your Rusalka charms to bend me to your will, my wife?
He'd meant the words to have more of an edge, to hold some of the accusation they had every right to hold. But they came out a whisper, a lover's voice in a dark bedroom. Kirill opened his eyes. Irina's eyes remained a warm brown, not the drowning black they would have been had she been using her otherworldly powers of seduction. Still, surely there must be some magical explanation for the desperate urge surging through his body to take her in his arms and ravish her where she stood. Dwarves and dirt be damned.
I need no Rusalka charms for you.
Irina nuzzled his cheek, her skin sliding deliciously against his jaw.
You love me, and you wouldn't dream of denying me one paltry day.
Kirill pressed his forehead to Irina's, ruefully doing something he so rarely did, capitulate. "They will be here all the earlier the next day," he warned half-heartedly. Irina pulled back and clapped her hands, her eyes sparkling like dancing pixie lights.
Excellent. I'll need to do a bit of last-minute shopping to make certain we have enough food. Loop tells me Etienne's appetite can be frightening, and ever since Patrizio mysteriously grew in size, Marcellus says he's eating more to compensate for that as well.
It will be a wonder if there's anything left in the larder, Kirill agreed, resigned to his fate. He supposed it was the price he paid for having Irina as his wife. In that light, perhaps it wasn't such a sacrifice. The rustling of large leathery wings and a chilling breeze preceded a jovial voice. "Make sure you get lots of peppermint bark. Saturnalia isn't Saturnalia without peppermint bark." Kirill cursed the entire kingdom of Nysa as Irina slipped from his arms to greet their guest with a warm smile on her beautiful red lips. If there was one thing he resented more than capitulating, it was being robbed of the reward his wife usually bestowed upon him after capitulating.
Adonis, how wonderful to see you. It's been too long already.
Irina glided over to envelop the Prince of Nysa in a hug.
Saturnalia? That is what you celebrate on the winter solstice, yes? What we call Colida.
The demon's wings wrapped around her as he happily reciprocated the gesture, the towering bone and leather of his wings almost swallowing Irina's cloaked body in their folds. "Always a pleasure, Irina. And yes, Saturnalia is very similar to your Colida. Plenty of reasons for us to celebrate together." "Adonis, you have exceptionally poor timing." Kirill paused, the incubus's words coming back to him as an afterthought. "What is peppermint bark?" As Kirill repositioned himself to face his visitor, he noted with amusement that the dwarves were brandishing their mining equipment at Adonis. Small faces lined with wary distrust peered from the dusty atmosphere of the mine, the air stirred by the Nisan prince's arrival. Pickaxes and shovels hovered in the air before them, ready to fly at the intruder upon the slightest provocation. Kirill couldn't help but wonder if the incubus prince had ever seduced one of the dwarf females in his wild days before he'd met his wife. Or perhaps dwarves just don't trust demons. The demon's wings twitched as he settled them against his back, his usual smile undeterred by the bristling dwarves. "Peppermint bark is delectable white chocolate sprinkled with shards of mint-flavored candy canes." He furrowed his eyebrows at Kirill, which, in retrospect, would be irrelevant for someone who doesn't eat solid food. "It may behoove you to travel in more human form," Kirill observed, gesturing for the dwarves to lower their pickaxes and get back to work. "Surely the wings are attention-grabbing enough. The horns are unnecessary." Adonis tilted his head, letting the firelight from the lanterns cast shadows on the large horns curling up from his temples around the sides of his head before arching up into wicked points. "I spent years trapped in human form. If I choose to keep my own form now, then I don't see how anyone could begrudge me that." The demon slid his attention from Kirill back to Irina. "May I say, Irina, Ivy and I are both terribly excited about dinner tomorrow. It was such a pleasure to get your invitation." Kirill arched an eyebrow at his wife. "The invitations have already been sent out. Not exactly pining away as you waited for my answer, were you?" He shook his head. "I must have done something terribly wrong to imbue you with such confidence that you could get your way." Irina waved him off as she stepped back from Adonis.
"I knew you would give me Colida. You're not nearly so frightening as you think you are."
Kirill sketched a mental note to speak with Irina about brushing him off in front of his subjects. Bad enough he'd never been able to intimidate her. He did have a reputation he needed to keep up. He hadn't had to kill anyone to maintain his reputation in ages, and it would be a shame if he had to start now. Chapter 2. Collider be damned, Kirill muttered. The wind gusted against the window, sending a frigid breeze blowing around the heavy curtains and into the room. The fire in the hearth roared with renewed life as the air stirred the embers, whipping them into a glowing mass of throbbing coals. Kirill slammed his weapons belt down on his dresser and stalked over to the window. The sun peeked over the horizon, the first pink rays stabbing into the night sky and leaving bloody red trails in its wake. Kirill gritted his teeth and pulled the window closed, locking it tight and then settling the thick curtains to be certain no light shone through. He glanced at his empty bed and scowled. "Collider be damned," he repeated, this time with more force. Irina had been adamant that she couldn't come to bed yet. Something about getting the dining hall properly decorated. Normally, Kirill would have been only too pleased to set her loose, knowing that his father would be dismayed upon rising to find that his precious castle had been festooned with all the winter solstice holidays' trimmings. Irina had been conspiring with the pixies to make their coming dinner with friends magical, and Kirill had no doubt that not a single square inch of the sprawling dining hall would escape unglittered. It would be a miracle if his father didn't take off for the country manor just to escape the festivities. Unfortunately, no amount of discomfort on his father's part could make up for Kirill going to bed alone after he and Irina quarrelled. As much as it infuriated him to admit it, he needed to hold Irina in his arms after conversations such as the one they'd had today, conversations that underlined how very different they were. Though they'd said good night on soft terms, today's episode in the mine had made Kirill all too aware of how very different he was from Irina, and he feared it had shown her the same. There was no doubt in Kirill's mind that Irina saw him as a skriyaga, a sour old miser with no interest in festive holidays or warm gatherings with friends. The complete opposite of the rebellious Rusalka, whose goal was to see everyone in the kingdom as happy as she was. Kirill sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, absent-mindedly sliding his hand under his pillow to check for the knives he kept hidden there. He paused, eyeing Irina's side of the bed. One hand rose of its own accord to rub his chest, trying to ease the sudden ache over his heart.
"It is only a matter of time until she sees the real you, young master."
The blade was in Kirill's hand before his mind fully registered the intruder, muscles tense, ready to stab at whoever had dared to invade his sanctuary. The adrenaline roared so loudly in his veins that it took him a full minute to recognize the voice, to pass the deep, rough tenor from the myriad of others he'd encountered. If he'd had a heartbeat, it would have stuttered to a halt inside his chest.
Rasputin?
The name scarcely escaped Kirill's lips, the urge to hold it in almost overwhelming. He hadn't spoken that name in so long. Not since before that horrible night. The night everything had ended and everything had begun. The night he died. A glowing apparition floated from behind the bed curtain. So close, Kirill had to clamp down on the urge to leap from the bed in startled fright. He narrowed his eyes at the intruder, a ghostly form wearing the rough cloak of a holy man. The thick brown beard was exactly as Kirill remembered it, the black eyes still the same piercing gaze that had once sent children screaming into their parents' arms. That face had never frightened Kirill. Even as a human boy, he'd known that Rasputin was a man of power and influence, a man who could help him to become the powerful ruler he was destined to be. It had been among the worst nights of his life when he'd risen from the grave after the coup to discover his family's adviser remained dead and decaying in his grave. Rasputin hovered closer, and Kirill's attention fell to the long coat of sheep's wool under the cloak, wet and heavy with mud. It was the garb of those who came from Iri, the land of the dead.
You are one of the Kolledari,
Kirill's words came out a mere whisper, his voice hushed by the strange energy slowly filling his bedroom. He brushed at his arm, pretending to have spotted a piece of lint to cover his attempt to rid himself of the eerie sensation crawling over his skin. He crafted his face into his courtly mask, the impenetrable expression he used to hide his thoughts from the world. "It was my understanding that when the Colledari come from Irie, they wear grotesque masks to scare away demons. Are you so confident that your own face is frightening enough?" He wrinkled his nose. "Or are you counting on the smell of wet wool to frighten away your demons?"
"You have grown insolent since your death,"
Rasputin answered, his voice the same deep, gravelly tone that Kirill remembered so well.
"Enjoy your superiority while you can. I have not come tonight to sing you carols or rid your home of demons."
His black eyes shone with strange light.
"You are the only demon in this room, young master."
Kirill's attention fell to the heavy saber hanging at Rasputin's side. The metal shone dully in the firelight, the handle heavy and smooth from the caress of a hand. A well-used weapon. "And do you intend to drive me out, then?"
"Quite the contrary. I have come to make certain you do not share my fate. When it is your time to travel to the land of the dead, I want to make sure you arrive in Irie on better terms than I."
Rasputin gestured at the painting hanging over the bed, the wedding portrait of Kirill and Irina.
"You have taken a strong first step, young master, but I fear even she will not remain at your side if you cannot see the error of your ways."
"Error?" Kirill replaced the knife under his pillow. It would do him no good against a spectre, anyway.
"You fight to rule your people, Kirill, but you do not yet live among them, understand them. You concentrate on what's best for them, but you do not know them. You forge relationships like one forges chains, strong but unfeeling, and more of a prison than a partnership."
"You sound like Irina." The words escaped before Kirill could stop them, and he tensed at the knowing look that came over Rasputin's face.
"Indeed, and that is why you will lose her."
"I will never lose her," Kirill snarled. "I would die for Irina."
"You have already died."
Rasputin crossed his arms, tucking his hands into either sleeve of his cloak.
"What you must do is live for her."
"You want me to find some way to resurrect myself?" Kirill's blood ran cold, his mind immediately flying to Ayana, the princess of the kingdom of Mu, wife of Samal. She had successfully raised the dead in the past, an act Kirill had most actively sought to avoid and barely managed to escape. "I have no wish to be a mere human." Rasputin pinched the bridge of his nose.
"Always so literal,"
he muttered.
"Kirill, there is more to living than a pulse. You work and you study and you plan on the life you will have, the life you will create for your people, but you take no time to appreciate it. I fear when your time on earth is done, you will have spent your entire existence working for a reward you never enjoyed."
"I enjoy my pursuits. I have no need for meaningless frivolity." Rasputin's eyebrow rose.
"And what of your wife? Is she content to leave you to your pursuits while she alone enjoys frivolity?
It's only one day. Spend it with me, with our friends.
Irina's voice echoed back to him, the soft plea in her tone tugging at his heart just as it had then. Something must have shown on his face, because Rasputin nodded.
There, you see.
He leaned back and narrowed his eyes.
Even as a boy, you were never one to have playmates or while away your days with games and fun. Never have I known a boy so studiously dedicated to his future, and nothing else.
You helped me a great deal back then. Kirill shifted, eyeing his former adviser. There was something about his posture, about the energy swirling around him. It was the same posture the man had held when focusing on a topic of study that Kirill found a waste of time. He had something to say that Kirill wasn't going to like.
And I will help you again.
Rasputin's face settled into firm, unemotional lines.
Today you will be visited by 3 spirits.
Kirill started, eyes whitening slightly.
3? Listen to them, Kirill. Hear what they have to say. They may be your last chance.
What kind of spirits? Polivoy? Mara? Nichnitsia? Kirill's mind whirled, spinning through everything he knew of spirits, trying to analyze weaknesses, purposes, but the term was too broad. He needed more information.
Kirill, you cannot plan for this. You cannot come up with ways to destroy them or blackmail them. They are not coming to harm you. They are coming to help.
Rasputin floated closer, the end of his ghostly cloak not touching the ground.
Listen, young master. Hear what they have to say and take it to heart. My fate does not have to be yours.
I am a vampire. Kirill's nerves sang with tension as if 1,000 pixies had landed on his body at once. I am already dead, and after this existence has ended, there will be nothing for me. Rasputin's eyes crackled with power, the air in the room sharpening somehow, biting at the skin.
Do you think you know more of the afterlife than me, young master?
This is my afterlife. Light flared in Rasputin's eyes, an unholy glow that was both hot and cold at the same time. A searing pain lanced Kirill's eyes as he looked at him. He winced and stepped back, averting his gaze.
If you refuse to listen, refuse to hear, then there will come a time when we will talk again, and you will mourn that you did not heed my words. I failed your family once. I will not fail them again.
His voice was a raw hiss now, thick with emotion.
You will live, Kirill. Even as you stay a moving corpse, you will live if I have to tear your unbeating heart out to make you do it.
Do not threaten me. Kirill staggered back towards his dresser, feigning fear of the light shining from Rasputin's eyes, even as he groped behind him for the vials he kept in one of his dresser drawers. He had holy water in there somewhere.
Expect the first spirit today.
Rasputin's form lost detail, becoming just a vaguely human-shaped vapor as he faded into light mist. The sun will be at its height at 1. I'll be dead. Let the spirit talk to my corpse. Kirill's words echoed in the room as Rasputin's ghost faded away completely. As the last trace of the apparition vanished, the fire in the hearth crackled and died, growing smaller as if the ghost's presence had been feeding it, and it was weaker for Rasputin's absence. The warmth fled from the room, a temperature change that shouldn't have affected Kirill in the slightest. He shivered nonetheless, then cursed himself for it. Nerves still singing like rabid wolves crying to the moon, Kirill stalked over to the fire and stirred the embers. The room was too cold, the bite in the air too sharp. He wasn't certain when Irina intended to come to bed, but he didn't want her to enter an icebox when she did.
Today you will be visited by 3 spirits. Listen to them, Kirill. Hear what they have to say. They may be your last chance.
Kirill retrieved a few vials from the drawer of his dresser. Holy water, acidic dragon saliva, and a few others. He brought them to the bed and tucked them underneath his pillow alongside the weapons already nestled there. Rasputin's words haunted him as he drew the curtains closed around his bed, providing a second shield against the daylight. He lay down in his clothes, not bothering to undress since Irina wouldn't be coming to bed before he died. Staring up at the ceiling, Kirill half-heartedly ran through the spirits he'd encountered in the past. What spirits would be visiting him? Would they speak, or would they show him images? Would they project themselves into the blackness that swallowed him when he died, or would they wake him, bring him out of his daily death? Too many questions and not enough answers. For one shining moment, Kirill was thankful he didn't sleep as humans did. Surely, with all he'd heard tonight, sleep would have been impossible. He closed his eyes and ran through his list of spirits one more time before he died. Chapter 3. The scent of werewolf woke him. That unmistakable musk that made one feel as though an animal was lying on his face, overlaid with the sharp scent of shredded leaves. Kirill met the land of the living with a bone-jarring, senses-searing awareness, eyes flying open, upper body jolting off the bed. His fingers tightened over the blade that he'd drawn automatically as he sat up. His curtains remained unmoving, still surrounding his bed, still cloaking him in darkness. But there was no mistaking the earthy aroma of wolf, the familiar warm power of a shapeshifter oozing over his body. Etienne? As if saying the Prince of Sanguinet's name had summoned him, the werewolf's familiar golden eyes suddenly appeared, glowing like fireflies in the dark forest. Kirill blinked, his keen night vision showing him Etienne's form in faint, shadowed outlines. He hadn't felt the bed move, hadn't seen the curtains part. How had Etienne gotten so far into the castle, so far into Kirill's private chambers? He tightened his grip on his blade. "Etienne, what are you doing here?" Kirill kept the emotion out of his voice, even as his mind worked furiously to figure out why he was awake, what time it must be. Irina was absent. She still had not come to bed. Surely she would have come to greet him if it was nightfall. He felt inside himself, finding that lethargic weight that fell upon him when the sun began to rise in the sky, the almost sickening heat he could feel no matter how cold the air was. It was most certainly daytime.
"I've never liked you."
Etienne shifted on the bed, the furs tugging beneath Kirill's body.
"I know you better now. No, you're not as evil as I once thought you were, but you're still a corpse. My senses revolt in your presence, screaming at me that you don't belong. You're dead."
"You aren't Etienne." Kirill eased his body closer to the headboard, sliding his hand beneath his pillow. He slowly groped for the vial of holy water.
"Why do you doubt your senses?"
Etienne's voice was amused. The Sanguinean prince Kirill knew as Etienne was never amused. It confirmed his suspicion. solidified his deduction that the werewolf prince would never have violated his sanctuary in this way. Kirill loosened the stopper of the vial, careful not to spill it on his skin. "It takes so little to affect the senses," Kirill said calmly, his gaze still locked on the glowing eyes in front of him. "Only a fool allows his senses to tell him what his mind knows cannot be true." "Typical vampire," Etienne mocked. "Too smart for his own senses." The golden eyes sharpened, something foreign sliding behind the glowing orbs. "Be that as it may, it might behoove you, Vampire Prince, to accept what your senses are telling you and probe no further. There are other, less pleasant forms the spirit of Kaleida past may take. You may well be grateful to me for choosing a form that would be comforting for you, especially since it took such effort on my part to find a creature on this earth that doesn't hate you and would be seen as unthreatening." "Spirit of Kaleida past." Kirill ignored the spirit's barb, the open vial held carefully in his grip. "Then you are the spirit Rasputin spoke of." The golden eyes bobbed in the darkness as if the creature nodded. "I am." Kirill opened his mouth, but Etienne's voice cut him off. "Do not plague me with questions. Trying to figure out my origin, my weaknesses, would be a waste of time for us both. You will have to accept my word that I am not here to harm you. The day does not last forever, and I have much to show you. Will you be taking me somewhere, then?" Kirill asked cautiously, furiously trying to decide how far to let this spirit go. Rasputin had told him to listen. He'd said nothing of traveling with the spirit. There was a fine line between heeding his old mentor's advice and being unspeakably foolish. Blindly following an insulting ghost fell firmly in the latter category.
"I would not want you to burn."
The ghost's voice was slow, patronizing.
"And in any case, your mind can travel faster than your flesh. So look around you, Prince of Dacia, and tell me what you see."
Kirill glanced to the side and went deathly still. He wasn't in bed, not in his room. He blinked, hands flying out to feel the bed underneath him. It was all gone. The curtains had vanished, and a new scene had sprung up around him, so that he now stood in another room in his castle, the library. Books surrounded him on all sides, bookcases covering the walls, tome upon tome bearing down on him, reminding him of lessons that had been drilled into his head so long ago. The scent of old parchment and worn leather filled his senses. Each spine brought a new memory, a new piece of knowledge that he'd hoarded. Information was power, and he'd wanted it all.
"Young master, that is not the text you were assigned."
Rasputin's voice sliced through the air, cracking like a whip. Kirill whirled around to find a child sitting at a small desk set up by the library window. Sunlight shone through the glass, and Kirill tensed. There was no burning, though, no searing pain. The sunlight was as fake as the child that was remarkably familiar.
"It's me."
The words passed his lips in a hushed whisper, shock and intrigue threatening to steal his voice entirely. The child at the desk shared his white blonde hair, the locks pulled back into a severe ponytail that fell past his shoulders. His skin was pale, though not as much as it was now. Of course, he'd been alive back then.
"I've finished that text."
Young Kirill did not take his eyes from the book in front of him, gaze still sliding across the page.
"And the one after that. If you cannot keep up, then perhaps the king and queen should assign me a new tutor."
Rasputin snatched a book from the shelf beside him and brought it down with a resounding slam on Kirill's desk. Young Kirill raised his eyes from the page he'd been reading to look at his tutor.
You read the history book I gave you on Dacia, young master?
Rasputin's voice was eerily calm, almost musical.
But what book did you progress to after that?
The next Dacian historical text,
Kirill answered, his tone bored.
Why?
The text you should have read after the first Dacian historical text is the first Songhanean historical text.
A furrow appeared between young Kirill's brows.
Why?
Because, young master,
Rasputin answered, black, beady eyes shining.
Knowing your enemy is the first step in defeating them.
He leaned forward, putting his face closer to Kirill's.
Or do you intend to rule over only part of the world?
A slow smile spread across young Kirill's face. He closed the book he'd been reading and opened the one Rasputin had dropped on his desk. The bearded adviser turned away, leaving the young prince to his studies. "Bred from a young age to dream of world domination," Etienne muttered. "Is it any wonder you're such an ass?" A scathing retort leapt to the tip of Kirill's tongue, but it vanished at the sight of the ghost standing beside him. He would have sworn it was really Etienne. He dressed in the same rough trousers the werewolf prince wore more often than not, the same tailored shirt clinging to his broad chest. Polished boots, too heavy for most noblemen, graced his feet, ideal for all the trekking the werewolf did through the woods. The scent, the energy, it all matched Etienne. It took a great deal of power to mimic a living being so precisely. He shook off the shiver trying to rattle his spine. What manner of being has Rasputin set on me? "You were always alone for these lessons with Rasputin." Etienne leaned against a bookshelf, shifting his wide shoulders as if scratching his back on the shelves. "Other lessons were shared with some of the other noble children, but never these." "These lessons were private because they were meant to prepare me to rule," Kirill said stiffly. "There was no reason for the other children to be here. They did not share my future."
"But there was one boy who was to share your future."
Etienne's brown eyes shifted to gold, his voice dropping to a gravelly canine bass.
"Wasn't there?"
Kirill's stomach dropped, a strange clammy feeling sliding over his skin. A memory long buried stirred beneath layers and layers of his past, fighting to be heard again. "No," he whispered, trying and failing to inject some force into the word. "I do not wish to see that winter solstice." His words fell on deaf ears. The scenery around them changed again, colors melting, swirling and reforming. They were still in the castle, but this time they were in the grand ballroom. Music wafted through the air from the orchestra playing in the corner, and men and women dressed in their collider finery twirled around the dance floor. The stench of fear that usually permeated the air when the nobles were forced to attend a royal celebration post-coup was mitigated, a low hum instead of the dull roar it usually was. Collider lifted spirits, and it seemed that not even a vampiric king and queen peering down with dead eyes and ghostly pale faces could completely dampen that spirit. None of the festivities mattered. Kirill remembered this winter solstice, remembered it even though part of him had tried so hard to forget it, to banish the memory forever. He was inexplicably pulled to the drawing-room right off the main ballroom, driven to open the door and step into the relative silence, closing the door behind him as he had so many years ago. The ghost remained at his side, without ever seeming to move. His Etienne disguise was so perfect, Kirill could almost believe he would be there to offer comfort for what was coming.
if indeed the real Etienne would have offered him comfort after seeing what was to transpire. Together, they followed the sound of angry voices that were beginning to grow in volume.
Traitor!
Kirill fought the urge to close his eyes, to block out the face he knew he was about to see. The sound of his own voice killed whatever hope he'd had that somehow this was not the Kaleida memory he feared.
I am no traitor, Yevgeny. I am the prince, and it is my responsibility to do what is best for my kingdom.
A young man stood dressed in a thick, heavily embossed tunic, gold all but smothering the deep green of the fabric, the color of holly leaves. His black hair was pulled into a tight ponytail at his neck, leaving nothing to obstruct his dark, flashing eyes. His voice was tinged with desperation, the slightly hysterical note as plain to Kirill now as it had been all those years ago.
We had an accord. You agreed to support me if I moved against the Malenkovs.
Kirill steeled himself against the empty expression in his younger self's eyes as his comrades seethed in front of him. He was older now than he'd been in the last memory, no longer the child under Rasputin's tutelage, but a grown man. The deathly pallor of his skin was another reminder that the coup that had made his family into vampires had already passed. Rasputin was dead now.
We had nothing in writing,
young Kirill said calmly,
and I'm afraid another offer has arisen that will be more beneficial to my people. I cannot sacrifice the greater good. Greater good!
Yevgeny spat on the floor, the heat of his fury blistering, even through all these years.
You care nothing for anyone other than yourself.
He straightened his spine, though there was a tremble in his lean arms that betrayed him.
I am already committed to this war. The Malenkovs will not walk away now. They will not stop until my family has nothing left. If you will not stand behind me, I will lose everything. If I stand behind you, the alliance I've managed to attain will fail, and more than just your family will suffer.
Young Kirill strode toward the door.
I'm afraid you will have to bear the consequences of your own choices. Traitor!
Yevgeny screamed. Kirill closed his eyes, struggling against the desire to cover his ears and block out this unfortunate piece of his past.
Yevgeny.
He turned to the ghost and opened his eyes.
Take me away from this place.
He was your best friend, Etienne mused. And you abandoned him all because she told you to. Because she promised to help you gain more power. I know what I did. Kirill pressed his lips together, squaring his shoulders and opening his eyes.
The coup was still fresh in people's minds. Their distrust of my kin, of the knowledge that the royal family now consisted of vampires, overwhelming them. It was only a matter of time until they got up the nerve to try again, to come at us with fire and holy water. I needed more influence from creatures beyond humanity. I had no connection to that world yet.
But Serafina did. The mention of Irina's stepmother fell over Kirill like a bucket of ice slivers, sharp and freezing.
Yes. Does Irina know that you betrayed your best friend to earn the loyalty of the woman who tried to kill her?
Kirill didn't answer, the lump in his throat cutting off any words he might have spoken in his defense. Irina knew about his former alliance with her stepmother, had almost lost her life because of it. It had never seemed the right time to confess how far back his alliance with Serafina had gone. Indeed, he tried very hard to convince himself that it wasn't necessary to share that with Irina at all, ever.
Friends were never important enough to you to make you pause your drive for power, your drive for more.
Etienne stalked around Kirill, a predator circling its prey.
Yevgeny lost everything when the Malenkovs discovered he tried to take over their land. He followed the advice you gave him, used the strategy you yourself devised to weaken their holdings, and just when he was ready to make his final move, you abandoned him. He was your only friend. The scenery around them faded, darkness eating away at the walls of the drawing room. Kirill couldn't help but glance at Yevgeny, stare at his old friend until blackness swallowed everything and all that remained was Etienne's golden eyes hovering in the darkness beside him.
Yorina would sacrifice any amount of power for friend. Her heart far more important to her than her power,
Etienne whispered.
She gave you her heart, believed she received yours in return. How long will it take her to realize you never had a heart to give her?
Chapter 4. Kirill's eyes flew open. The curtains tented above his bed played tricks on his mind, for a moment making it appear as though he were gazing into a swirling, bottomless void. He saw Yevgeny's face in that void, his eyes burning, his voice sharp and tinged with the unmistakable ring of panic. For a second, Kirill thought he felt his own heart beat one solitary thud. Or perhaps that was just another memory. Steel dagger, small vial of holy water, dragon's saliva. Kirill ran his fingers over the weapons under his pillow. Each one was smooth, familiar, comforting. The memory of Yevgeny, the reminder of the betrayal he hadn't thought of in ages, settled against his skin like acid, burning, eating through his flesh. Kirill remained still, staring unblinking up at the curtains, peering into that false, swirling void.
The past must remain untouched,
he whispered.
No one can turn back time.
Over and over he caressed his weapons, searching for the comfort their presence usually brought him. His weapons were security, protection, but not against ghosts.
Today you will be visited by 3 spirits. Listen to them, Kirill. Hear what they have to say. They may be your last chance.
This ghost had reached into the past with unerring accuracy and pulled forth perhaps the one true regret Kirill had. There had been many betrayals in his past. Many times he'd used a loophole to escape from one bargain to enter into a more beneficial one. It was strategy, pure and simple. He made the decisions that would benefit him the most, and by benefiting him, benefit his people. But no betrayal had ever haunted him like that first one. Like Yevgeny. Perhaps it was no coincidence that he hadn't had a friend since. Kirill closed his eyes again, willing his body to die, to spill him back into the dreamless darkness. The undulating heat and sickness that writhed inside him, letting him know the sun was high in the sky, grew warmer. The spark of consciousness inside him flickered and began to fade as he died for the second time that day. It seemed he had scarcely had a moment's peace when the rustle of feathers assaulted his ears like the mad flurry of a flock of crows. The bed dipped again, farther this time, Kirill's entire body tilting with a sudden weight on the end of his mattress. Kirill opened his eyes, resigned to another visit and determined not to let this ghost best him as the last one had. "The ghost of Collider present, I presume?" Kirill paused, considering. The first ghost had taken the form of Etienne, and now he heard rustling feathers and felt a great weight pressing down on the space before him. "You've taken the form of the angelic prince of Meropis," Kirill guessed. "Interesting." Patrizio's chiseled face met Kirill's gaze as he opened his eyes, the angel's blue stare as piercing as always. His enormous white wings were so bright compared to the rest of him that they seemed almost disembodied, towering limbs of light on a figure carved from shadow.
Do not mistake my lack of rancor for absolution,
Patrizio told him, his voice sounding deeper in the darkness. Kirill sat up slowly. He focused on the blue eyes glowing slightly in the darkness, a more ethereal glow than the gold of the werewolf. Patrizio did not offer anything further, merely sat there silently, waiting. "I need no one to absolve me," Kirill said finally, keeping his voice calm and even. "Absolution is for sinners. I am merely a practical man building a future for himself and his people."
You think because I never judged you as violently as I did the demon, that your soul is not as dark as his. Some part of you believes that my lack of condemnation on your part is a sign that you are not as evil as you fear you are.
The ghost that wore Patrizio's form spoke as the angel did, plain and unapologetic. Kirill bristled. "I have no soul for you to judge." Patrizio shifted on the bed.
That would be easier, wouldn't it? If you had no soul to sully, you wouldn't have to worry. You could do whatever needed to be done. No thought to what danger you put your immortal soul in.
"I have no soul," Kirill repeated, cursing himself for the unnecessary intensity. Even to his own ears he was protesting too strongly, the emotion in his voice giving away far too much. He closed his eyes, mentally cleared his mind. The ghosts were here to show him the error of his ways, to twist his mind into painful shapes and make him regret his decisions. He had to be firm, calm. He'd had good reasons for everything he'd done. There was no reason to be ashamed of them now. He faced the angel once again. The ghosts seemed to mimic the other princes so perfectly. Perhaps that was the key to speaking with them. After all, he knew the weaknesses of his fellow princes. "Are you finally done with the demon, then, and ready to move on to judging me? Will Sawmel be next? Have his bloodthirsty ways finally snared the attention of the avenging angel?" Patrizio snorted.
So eager to throw another victim into my path. What would Irina say?
Kirill stiffened. "Leave my wife out of this."
Leave her out of it? Well, why don't we see how long you can hold on to that?
The change in scenery didn't shock Kirill this time, didn't disorient him as the last ghost had. Perhaps it helped that this time he was taken to somewhere more recently familiar, and obviously not in the past. He was standing in the palace of Nyssa, in the rooms that the king and queen had allocated to Adonis. A large easel stood in the middle of the room, holding up a giant canvas on which two figures were swirling colours around like mad. A red blob of paint hurtled through the air, passing through Kirill's body as if he weren't there. He arched an eyebrow at the source of the flying colours, noting with amusement that Adonis had managed to smear paint clear up the length of his horns. Spatters of green, red, silver, and gold made the curving points sparkle in the blinding light coming from the woman standing beside him at the canvas. She glowed as though she'd swallowed the sun, as if the heavenly body was trying to escape through her pores. Even that glow paled in comparison to the brilliance of the smile lighting up her face, which was also smudged with a rainbow of colours matching those on the canvas in front of her.
"Do you think he's going to show?"
The woman, Ivy, Adonis's wife, squinted at a pine tree she'd painted on the canvas. She swiped at it a few more times with her brush, filling out the boughs until the tree seemed to bow with the weight. "It's hard to tell with Kirill," Adonis answered, swirling his paintbrush over a castle tower, spreading silver over the ramparts until they sparkled like fresh snow.
This looming contract with the dragons has him working pretty hard. Usually he can find sneaky ways to force people to sign alliance contracts with him, but the dragons don't care about anything they can't add to their treasure pile. Kirill's had to make the rounds of all his mines personally to get the dwarves working overtime to get all the riches he needs to tempt the scaly beasts.
I'm surprised he has to keep such a close eye on them,
Ivy commented.
I thought dwarves loved to work.
Oh, they do. But you don't understand how much Kirill needs. Even dwarves have to sleep sometime. Mining isn't exactly light work.
Kirill frowned. He allowed the dwarves plenty of sleep.
So you think he'll skip Irina's Saturnalia dinner to keep working?
Adonis shrugged and rubbed at one of his horns, smearing a fresh layer of scarlet up the bony protrusion. That's possible. Kirill isn't really one for celebrating. Even when he has a reason to celebrate, he tends to just move on to the next goal.
He shrugged.
It's probably why he's as powerful as he is.
Poor Irina.
Kirill and Adonis both turned to Ivy, brows furrowed.
Why poor Irina?
Adonis asked. Ivy put her paints down and slid her arms around Adonis's waist. He welcomed her into his arms, wrapping his wings around her for good measure as she cuddled against him.
I think it's sad. She loves him, and she's married to him, but he doesn't spend time with her.
He spends time with her.
Adonis waggled his eyebrows.
Quality time.
Ivy rolled her eyes and slapped her husband on the chest.
There's more to a marriage than sex, husband of mine.
She gestured to the painting.
How would you feel if I never wanted to paint with you? If other than sex, I just ran around pursuing my own interests and left you to amuse yourself? Would you really be happy if you only saw me when we went to bed, or when we had a formal function to attend together?
Adonis frowned.
You think Irina's unhappy?
Ivy settled against his chest, stroking Adonis's bare skin almost absent-mindedly.
If she's not now, she will be. I've met Irina, Adonis. She's much too friendly and outgoing to be content with a husband who doesn't care about her friends. She's a social person. She thrives around other people. People like her aren't meant to be alone. If Kirill can't be part of that life...
Adonis laid his cheek against the top of Ivy's head.
Poor Kirill.
Enough! Kirill snapped, turning away from the couple. He wasn't certain if it was the couple's words or seeing them enjoying one another's company with such ease that riled his emotions into a stormy sea, but he wanted no more of this place regardless. I get the point. You're trying to tell me I don't spend enough time with my wife. Return me to my home.
It is interesting to me that you feel you have any control over this situation,
Patrizio mused.
I will return you home in due time. Right now, there is something else you need to see.
Patrizio waved an arm, wiping away their surroundings like a painter scrubbing a canvas clean. The scenery changed again. This time they were standing in a hovel, surrounded by rickety furniture. Black dust covered virtually every surface in a thin, fuzzy coat. Kirill frowned as dwarves scurried around him, one or two passing straight through his incorporeal form. It was a strange and somewhat unpleasant sensation, and Kirill stepped back until he stood near a wall, giving the little men around him as much space as the cramped quarters allowed. After a moment, Kirill recognized individual faces. These were the dwarves who had cared for Irina after he'd first found her, the ones she'd taken a particular shine to. They were practically family now, a fact that Kirill had lamented on more than one occasion.
Couldn't you have managed a bigger bird than that?
One of the dwarves, Ludmil, demanded, eyeing the pathetic creature being roasted on a spit over the fire.
That looks like it's just come out of its egg.
If you want to go out and find another creature for Collider dinner, you're welcome to it,
The dwarf manning the spit snapped. Pasha, Kirill believed he was called.
"This was all the traps caught. Perhaps you'd like to tell the prince that we've no time to work his mines because we've got to get a bird big enough for your gluttonous appetite."
Ludmil's face went pale, but he quickly covered it with a scowl. "Don't burn it." A hand on Kirill's arm made him turn, and he followed Patrizio's long arm to a corner. A dwarf stood there, leaning over, one hand braced against the wall. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes were scrunched closed, his face lined with deep creases. He breathed slowly through his nose, obviously in pain. Kirill tilted his head. He remembered that dwarf. His name was Ian. No, Ivan. A grumpy dwarf, to be sure, but Irina always spoke fondly of him.
"What's wrong with him?"
He kept his eyes on Ivan even as he spoke to Patrizio.
"Much, I'm afraid. His heart is weak, but he continues to work as hard as the others. Full of pride, that one."
Kirill brushed away the sense of unease that tried to crawl up his spine at the sight of Irina's friend in such pain.
"Demian could heal him easily. Why doesn't he say something?"
Patrizio arched an eyebrow.
"Why doesn't he march up to the palace and ask the prince's royal healer to see to his illness?"
Kirill tightened his jaw, irritation chafing him.
"He is dear to Irina. I would allow Demian to help him." "He is dear to Irina, but not to you. He never speaks to you because you never speak to him. In fact, you make it quite clear that however Irina sees them, you see them as workers, no different than they have always been. The dwarves know Irina cares for them, but they also know she's in love with you. They would never do anything to put her in an awkward position. I doubt it would have occurred to any of them to ask her for help."
"If he cannot ask for help, then he will die, and he will have no one to blame but himself." The words tasted like ash on his tongue, but Kirill steadfastly refused to take them back. He couldn't be responsible for keeping up with every worker, every friend of Irina's. If they couldn't ask for help, it was on their heads, not his. Patrizio shook his head, blonde hair sliding over his massive shoulders.
"Remember those words when the time comes and your wife is wearing all black, sobbing into your arms over the body of her dead friend."
The image came to Kirill's mind as clear as the full moon on a black night, conjured by the power in the angel's words. He could feel Irina's tears soaking into his tunic, the trembling of her body as she cried. He could almost picture the small coffin, Ivan's face finally absent of pain and life. He stumbled against the wall, but his hand failed to find the rough surface of the hovel's interior. Instead, his fingers brushed against soft fur. Kirill blinked and found himself back in his bed, hands pressed to the furs beneath him, staring at the same void in the curtains over his bed. The ghost was gone, leaving Kirill alone with his thoughts and the images that haunted him. Chapter 5. Kirill didn't bother lying down again. There was no point. Rasputin had said 3 spirits. That meant there was 1 ghost to go, and Kirill was ready to get it over with. He burned to hear what this final ghost had to say, was ready to retreat into his strategy room and think over all the information he'd been given. Surely he wasn't the first to receive these visits. There must be records of others somewhere. He would take what he'd learned, what the ghosts had shown him, and he would find a way to use the information to his advantage.
"Kirill, I can see the wheels in your head spinning."
It was Sarmal's voice, but this time there were no glowing eyes for Kirill to see. Oddly enough, the only thing that gave away the ghost's position was the shadow in the darkness. Not a real shadow, but a part of the darkness even more devoid of light, a man-shaped void that swallowed the very air around it. Kirill squinted, trying to focus his night vision, but only the shadow remained. "Your power is impressive," Kirill commented lightly, ruthlessly cutting the unease from his voice. He'd not spent much time with the god since he'd regained the full scope of his power. Sarmal was not his enemy, but Kirill didn't trust anyone with that much power. Sarmal shifted on the bed.
"My apologies if my presence is unsettling. Know that neither I nor the ghost mean you any harm."
Every muscle in Kirill's body tensed in unison, rendering him little more than a statue for the span of several heartbeats. When he finally regained his voice, it was a low, rasping sound, heavily weighted with a deep sense of foreboding.
"You and the ghost are not one?"
Sarmal shook his head slowly, a movement of shadows barely perceptible even to Kirill's senses.
"You have been possessed?" "I am a god, Kirill. Even the spirits of the winter solstice cannot completely take me over, not as they were able to claim Etienne and Patrizio."
Fresh tension poured over Kirill, filling his mind with images of his comrades being used as puppets, taken over against their will.
"Are they all right?"
When Sarmal spoke again, there was a hint of surprise in his voice.
"I am pleased you thought to ask that question, and with what sounds like genuine concern and not merely calculating interest. There was a time not so long ago you would not have bothered, would have seen their absence as a chance for you to gain more power yourself."
Sarmal shifted again on the bed, leaning forward slightly.
"You have come a long way, Kirill."
"If I have come so far, then perhaps here is where I should stop." Kirill heard the note of desperation in his voice, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Sitting here, this close to a god of death and prophecy, with the ghost of Collider Future hovering somewhere inside him, had every nerve in Kirill's body screaming in alarm, writhing in an invisible wind. He was suddenly absolutely certain that he did not want to see the future this ghost would show him.
"To answer your question, Etienne and Patrizio are fine. They will not remember their participation in your awakening. As for your suggestion that perhaps you have learned enough for one day, I'm afraid it cannot stop here. The ghost is quite insistent that you see the future you are carving for yourself."
The god sighed, and the sound sent a shiver down Kirill's spine.
"I'm sorry you have to see this, Kirill, but it is for your own good. Turn around."
Kirill didn't want to turn around. More than anything else in the world, he did not want to see what was waiting for him, what was giving him that horrible, spine-tingling sensation. He had one ridiculous moment where he wished he could see Sarmal's face, needing to glimpse something familiar. "Have you any comfort to offer, Sarmal?" The god shifted on the bed again, the blankets tugging underneath Kirill.
"Do you need comfort, Kirill?"
Kirill's mouth went dry, but he shook his head. "No."
"You will."
With those ominous words hanging in the air, the room shifted. There was no mistaking the sounds of war. The blood in the air, the shouts of passionate courage mixing with shrieks of horror and pain. Weapons buried with wet thuds into flesh and clanged loudly against other weapons. The energy crackled around him, biting him and stinging his flesh. For a moment he thought the ghost had gotten it wrong, that he was showing Kirill the past. because what he was hearing sounded an awful lot like the night he died, the night of the coup. Kirill blinked as the scene around him changed, but only slightly. He was still in his bedroom in the castle. Instead of sitting in his bed, he was standing beside his dresser. The room was bathed in sunlight. Someone had opened the curtains. Kirill tensed at the sight of the golden light touching his skin, instinct screaming at him to dive for cover, to find some dark room to hide in until sunset. But there was no burning, no pain. The sunlight was not real. A figure moved closer to the bed, the bed curtains still drawn tight against the sunlight. Tearing his attention away from his own sun-dappled skin, Kirill tensed as he recognized the creature. He looked human, but the stocky build, square-shaped head and yellowish skin marked him as half-troll. He crept across the floor, meaty hand outstretched. He's going to pull the curtain aside and let the sunlight in. Every muscle in Kirill's body tensed in shock as he realized that his future self must be sleeping in that bed. I'll burn. He frowned, shook his head. But that's not possible. I have a contract with the trolls. He cannot attack me.
Your contract with the trolls was attained through blackmail of a sort, wasn't it?
Sarmal mused.
You forced them into it.
Kirill stiffened. King Risi signed the contract. The circumstances are irrelevant. He is bound by its terms.
You are very skilled with contract language, Kirill.
Sarmal agreed.
That's probably why it took him so long to figure out how to get around the terms.
What do you mean?
There was something in the contract assuring the trolls that you wouldn't block them from gaining new territory, as long as that territory did not threaten another of your political alliances.
So?
That half-troll you see before you attempted to purchase land from one of the nobles of Dacia. He offered a handsome sum, and the noble was inclined to accept his offer. You blocked the sale. I believe you had some information that you were using to manipulate the noble who currently owned the house. If he'd sold his land, he would have had less influence, and would have been less useful as your pawn. You didn't realize the prospective buyer had Troll in his lineage.
Kirill's blood ran cold. King Risi used that to break our contract.
Yes. Then he stirred the peasants, urging them to stage another coup. He gathered other members from beyond the veil, those you were in the process of convincing to sign your contracts. They joined with the peasants and gave the people what they needed to gather their courage.
The troll inched closer to the bed. His footsteps were silent on the thick carpet, his eyes locked on the bed before him. King Risi loves Irina. The protest was scratchy in Kirill's throat, rasping from his lips like a desperate plea. He would never do this to her.
King Risi does love Irina, which is a large part of the reason he wants you eliminated. This is the future, Kirill. Over the years, Irina has changed, and not for the better. There are many who blame you.
No! A feminine voice cried out. As if responding to Sarmal's words, Irina rushed into the room. Kirill's eyes widened and he started forward, a sharp ache threatening to crack open his chest. The shine was gone from Irina's brown eyes. The light vanished from her face. The laugh lines at the corners of her eyes slanted down, marks of weariness instead of joy. Her shoulders sagged as though she carried a heavy weight. The velvet of her dress was solid black, a look of mourning that seemed to draw even more attention to her too thin form. The troll froze. Fingertips brushing the curtain was all that remained to protect Kirill's body from the sunlight.
Irina,
he rasped.
you should not be here. Go.
I won't let you hurt him. Irina held out a hand, pleading. Please, leave.
The king is outraged at what he's done to you,
the troll said, his face pinched with regret.
You don't come to visit us anymore. You hardly visit anyone.
Irina bit the inside of her cheek.
I'm sorry. I've been busy.
Busy helping the vampire, helping him trap more people with his contracts.
Irina winced.
He only wants to protect his people. He will be a good king.
He will never be king. He will die for good this day, and you will be free.
The troll pressed his lips into a thin line.
You weren't even at the dwarf's funeral. What was his name? Ivan.
The dwarf died then. Kirill stared at his wife, suddenly wishing with every fibre of his being that he was corporeal here, that he could take her in his arms and give her the comfort she needed. Irina's eyes shone with unshed tears, and she pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment. Her body bowed as if she were fighting not to collapse. I didn't know. No one told me.
You hadn't seen him in years, the troll accused. They took you in when you needed them, but he made you stay away.
He flung a hand toward the bed where Kirill lay in the protective cocoon of the curtains. He never forced me to stay away. I was just so busy.
You stopped visiting because he wouldn't come with you. You cared more about being near him than being near anyone else. And since he didn't want to visit mere dwarves with no political clout to offer, you stayed away too.
He needs me,
Irina whispered.
He's so lonely. He needs time.
He is out of time.
The troll grabbed the curtain. Irina screamed and dove to stop him, drawing a dagger from the belt of her dress. The troll's eyes bulged. Everything happened so quickly. There was a struggle as the troll writhed to avoid her blade, bent the dagger's point the other way. A wet choke escaped Irina as her body jerked, impaled on her own blade. Kirill didn't have time to shout as he threw himself forward. His arms passed right through his wife as he tried to catch her, tried to keep her body from hitting the floor. The troll squeaked in horror, staring down at the dagger buried in Irina's side.
Irina, no, I didn't mean...
He swiveled his head, staring at the curtains. Tears welled in his eyes, but he stepped away from her and grasped the thick material surrounding the bed. Sunlight fell over the figure lying perfectly still on top of the furs. Kirill knelt on the floor, unable to tear his eyes from Irina's deathly pale face long enough to see his body catch fire, start to burn. The acrid scent of burning flesh filled the room, but he ignored it. He sat there on the floor as black smoke poured from his immolated corpse. His heart withered, crushed to bloody pulp in his chest as the life fled from Irina's eyes, leaving her pale and limp on their bedroom floor.
Where is your power now, Kirill?
Sarmal gestured around them.
Where are your allies, your contracts? What good has all your planning done you?
My spies should have told me what King Risi was up to. Kirill's voice was as dull and lifeless as the pile of ashes on his bed. I should have known.
You cannot plan for everything, vampire. You cannot force people to help you, to be your ally. Irina tried for years to get you to be more personable, to build true friendships, to develop real roots among your people. She would have helped you, but you were so sure you knew a better way. Better to have a signature than a handshake, you always said.
Why do you delight in torturing me? The first warmth of anger rose to chase away the chill. Kirill slid his gaze over his shoulder to glare at Sarmal. What do you want from me?
This has never been about what I want, Kirill, and you know that.
Tears burned Kirill's eyes, showing his weakness to both the god and the ghost before him. These events can be changed. This nightmare does not have to come to be. Sarmal tilted his head.
The future is ever-changing. That is true. But do you possess the will to change it? The humility to do what must be done to change it? The future cannot be forced to sign a contract, Kirill. It cannot be blackmailed or...
I would do anything for her, Kirill snapped, his tears thickening his voice. Sarmal stepped closer, something alien shifting behind his bottomless black eyes.
Prove it.
I would be anything for her. His vision grew hazy, and he had to blink the tears away, let them loose to roll down his cheeks so he could see.
Prove it.
Kirill lowered his face to Irina's, tried to kiss her even though he couldn't touch her. The pain in his chest was unbearable, the breaking of a dead heart. 1,000 moments rushed through his mind, full of things he'd wanted to say to her, time he'd wanted to spend with her, wasted opportunities. I love her, he whispered, curling over her lifeless form. Sarmal knelt beside him and put a hand on his shoulder.
Prove it,
he said softly. Chapter 6. Warmth. A soothing balm pressed against his side, heat chasing away the chill of death. It was the first thing Kirill was aware of after he opened his eyes, the air stinging, the tears lingering there. Images melted from his mind like watercolors dripping down a soaking canvas. The pictures were fuzzy, but the emotions they'd branded him with were all too vibrant. Wetness slid down his cheek, and he blinked. Kirill, my love, what's wrong? Irina's voice caressed him, calming the nerves that still ached with the shock of seeing her die, watching the light fade from her beautiful eyes. Irina! Irina! Kirill shot up into a sitting position, twisting to the side and grabbing Irina's arms in a punishing grip. Her eyes widened, a gasp reminding him to ease his hold. He cursed himself for being so rough, but Irina leaned toward him, not a trace of fear in her eyes. Kirill, what on earth? Another tear slid down his cheek, but he ignored it. He rolled over, pinning Irina's blessedly warm body beneath his, relinquishing the squirming warmth of her against him through her thin cotton nightgown. Confusion knitted her brows, and she opened her mouth as if to protest, but Kirill didn't give her time to speak. He pressed his mouth over hers, kissing her the way he thought he would never be able to kiss her again. A squeak of protest escaped her lips, her hands pressing against his chest. He could almost hear her demanding an explanation, probing for the source of his tears. But he didn't want to talk. Not yet. He licked at the seam of her lips, begging her to let him in, to let him kiss her as he so desperately needed to. As usual, she seemed to sense his need. Her resistance melted, and she parted willingly for him, wickedly dragging her tongue over one of his fangs, blending the heady taste of her blood with their kiss. He groaned, blindly groping at her nightgown, trying to get it out of the way. The laugh that trickled from Irina's throat was the sweetest sound Kirill had ever heard. There was so much pleasure in that sound, joy infusing the notes as it seemed to infuse everything Irina did. His blood heated as he fought free of his clothing, cursing every second he was apart from Irina's delectable body. Her hair darkened, dripping water onto their sheets as her Rusalka heritage roared to the forefront, summoned by the desire that perfumed the air between them. She wrapped one hand around the back of his head, drawing him down to the exposed line of her throat. Her pulse throbbed beneath her pale skin, calling to him, beating only for him. He inhaled deeply, drawing in her scent, the mixture of her usual apple and cinnamon along with a sharp hint of pine that told him she'd been working hard on the decorations for her Kaleida celebration. The scents tantalized his senses as he slid his fangs into her flesh, drawing her warmth into him. She moaned, arching her body, writhing against the sheets. The wet heat of her body was too tempting. She was too ready, and he needed her too badly. With his fangs still buried in her neck, he growled and dug his fingers into her hip, holding her still as he slid the hard length of himself into her, body stilling as he was enveloped by her delicious heat. Irina cried out and thrust her hips, driving him farther inside her. He pulled his fangs from her body, licking at the blood seeping from her throat as he plunged into her, every thrust an assurance that she was here, she was alive. Those thoughts reminded him of the dream, the ghost. An image of Irina lying on the floor of their bedroom. The life draining from the wound in her side filled his mind. He choked on a desperate cry, burying his face in her neck so her heartbeat thundered in his ears. His body shook as he continued to thrust inside her, faster, harder, trying to fill his senses with her heat, her life, anything to banish that horrible nightmare. Irina came with a scream, her hands clawing at his back, head thrashing from side to side on the pillow, pressing her throat harder and harder against his mouth. He gave in to the urge to taste her, burying his fangs inside her for the second time as his own pleasure took him. He groaned into her neck, her blood pulsing against his tongue, spiced by the lingering desire infusing every drop. Every swallow brought her warmth deeper inside him, chased away a little more of the lingering cold. Peace slid over him like a warm, lazy cloud. As the last ripple trickled through his system, he collapsed on Irina, holding her as close as he could manage. The image from the dream was fading, but the emotions were still raw. That was a pain he knew he would never forget, would never allow himself to forget.
"Tears and passion,"
Irina murmured.
"If I didn't know any better, I would say my vampire had a nightmare."
Kirill fought not to tense as he pulled his lips into a smile and leaned back to gaze into Irina's eyes. The concern he saw there nearly undid him, but he held his mask in place. There would be time to tell her of his ordeal later. It was Kaleida, and he had much to do before Irina's dinner. "I trust your dinner plans are well underway." Irina nodded, though her eyes remained wary, still searching Kirill's face.
"The dining hall is gorgeous, and the cooks are only too pleased to be cooking a real feast. It isn't often they get to cook for royalty anymore."
Kirill snorted in amusement. "Indeed? Well, if you've got the situation well in hand, there are a few things I must see to before our friends arrive. He tripped over the word friends, but he didn't think that was the reason for Irina's sudden frown.
Kirill, you promised you would take tonight off. It's Collider.
That I know, my dear, and I will be with you shortly, I swear to you. There are just a few things that require my immediate attention. He dropped a quick kiss on her cheek, forcing himself not to linger, not to drag her along with him because he couldn't bear to part with her. The furrow between her brows told him she was worried enough. If he acted any stranger than he was, she'd have him lashed to the bed where she could interrogate him until he confessed. An entertaining thought, but not one that would accomplish all he needed to get done in the short amount of time he had. It took more concentration than Kirill cared to admit to dress himself, especially once Irina rose from the bed and arched her beautiful naked body in a long stretch. She winked at him as she swayed over to the wardrobe, and part of him desperately wanted to take her up on the challenge, to drag her back to bed and not leave until she couldn't walk. But the words of the ghost still lingered in his mind, dropped in Sarmal's severe tone.
Prove it.
The god's voice chased him down the hallway, intensifying his resolve. More than one servant scurried out of his way, their heartbeats pounding in his ears. He exploded out the front doors, the bitter winter wind clawing at him, snow stinging his cheeks. The warmth he'd gained from Irina was quickly leached away, stolen by the wind, but Kirill didn't care. He broke into a run, rushing into the dark forest. Every step was quicker than the last until he moved through the trees with all the grace and speed his kind were capable of. The scenery was a blur around him, but Kirill knew where he was going. Animals screamed as they scrambled out of his path, and snow flew up as he sped through drifts and sent sparkling powder flying into the air. By the time he arrived at the cottage, there was a thin layer of ice coating his cloak, his hair, and his face. He blinked, breaking some ice slivers from his eyelashes and brushing them away as he knocked on the door. The weathered wood rattled under the force of his blows. A moment later, it creaked open and a small face peered out at him through the gap. Straw-coloured hair covered his head and the majority of each cheek, matching bushy eyebrows meeting in a confused line along his brow. The dwarf's eyes widened, and he jerked the door open. "Your Majesty, come in. Please, come in." Kirill stepped inside, shaking off the eerie feeling of déjà vu as he noticed the minuscule bird roasting on the spit over their fireplace. The dwarves stopped what they were doing, all 7 of them coming to stand before him like prisoners lining up for the executioner. "Your presence is required today," he rasped, his voice rough from the cold. One of the dwarves, Ivan, scowled. He was the oldest of the 7, and his white hair flared out in defiance of any sort of grooming, his beard bobbing up and down as he spoke. "You told Irina you'd give everyone the day off." Despite his bravado, Kirill noticed the dwarf was trembling. His legs quivered so badly he feared the small man would collapse at any moment.
His heart is weak.
"Ivan, is it not?" The dwarf jutted his chin out, the shaking intensifying until it was a wonder he didn't fall over. "It is." "Your presence is not required in the mine." Kirill paused, struggling to find the right tone, the right words. For the first time in his afterlife he hadn't planned ahead, and now he found himself floundering, in front of dwarves. He sighed. "Irina tells me that Collider is a time to be spent with friends and family," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I know that Irina cares for you. You were her family when she had none. I think it would mean a great deal to her
if you would come to the castle for dinner."
The dwarves stared at him, eyes bulging and jaws hanging open. A wisp of black smoke curled through the room, followed by the scent of burning meat. Kirill raised an eyebrow. "We will have more than enough food, of course. Perhaps my offer is more tempting now that your own feast has become somewhat charred." Ludmil swore and made a beeline for the fireplace, nose wrinkling in disgust as he rescued the ashen remains of their dinner from the spit. His teeth were surprisingly bright in his grubby face, his dark black eyebrows a sharp contrast to his dull grey hair.
"So you're ordering us to come to dinner with you?"
Ivan demanded, jutting his chin out with enough force that he twitched with the effort of not falling forward with it.
"Ivan,"
Sasha squeaked, eyes bulging beneath ragged brown bangs. His boots creaked as he shifted nervously from foot to foot. The grumpy dwarf glared at his brother.
"What? It's Collider. A night off, according to his own self.
"It's for Irina,"
Sasha insisted.
I want to go,"
Ludmil announced, tearing the blackened bird from the spit and tossing it into the fire.
"Our dinner is ruined anyway, and I want to see Irina."
"It's all settled, then." Kirill dipped one hand into his cloak and drew out a bag of gold coins. He dropped the pouch in front of Ivan, nodding when the dwarf scrambled to catch it.
"What's this?"
Ivan mumbled, his hands shaking as he opened the pouch.
"A Collider bonus."
Kirill swept out the door, leaving the small horde of dwarves gaping after him. He directed his path towards the mountains and squared his shoulders. He had one more stop before he could return to Irina. Chapter 7.
Kirill, I swear to you, this is not what I arranged.
Kirill swept into the room, his movements jerky as his body attempted to thaw itself. Ice pinged against the stone floor as chips broke off his cloak and hair, leaving a melting trail in his wake. He smiled at Irina as she stood gaping at the dining table and the massive feast that had been laid out. There were 10 turkeys, each one nearly the size of one of the dwarves. Hot loaves of bread, enough to build a small house with, lay at a table to the side, each one glistening with butter and filling the room with the delicious aroma of freshly baked bread. Bowls of noodles, sweet potatoes, and cranberries filled every available space between the roasted birds. Sweets and treats of every kind imaginable were piled high on another table, the multicolored sugars glistening like jewels.
The meal I'd arranged was large,
Irina admitted. She waved a hand at the dining hall, encompassing the 3 tables' worth of food.
but it was nothing like this. I don't understand how Cook could have misunderstood me so completely.
Cook misunderstood nothing, Kirill said smoothly, taking his agitated wife into his arms. I spoke with her this evening before I left. I wanted to be certain there would be enough food for everyone.
Kirill, even with Etienne and Patrizio here, we do not need this much food,
Irina insisted. She tilted her head, tracing a finger in small circles over Kirill's chest.
Perhaps we could give some of the food.
She fell silent, brows furrowing as she scratched one nail down the edge of Kirill's cloak.
My love, why is your cloak frozen?
I've been out and about.
Without the carriage?
Telling her that the carriage would not have been fast enough for all the travelling he'd done would give away the surprise, so Kirill remained silent. Before he could think of an appropriate answer, the footman stepped into the dining hall.
Your Highness, your guests have arrived.
Kirill brushed his ice-encrusted cloak back off his shoulder, took Irina's hand in his, and tucked it into the crook of his arm. The lines between her eyebrows remained, her gaze darting between his frozen garments and the massive feast. He patted her hand as he led her to stand across the room to the side of the doorway so they could greet their guests as they entered.
"Trust me, Irina. I will not ruin Kaleida for you."
Prince Etienne and Princess Loup of Sanguinet.
The werewolf came through the doorway, decked out in the finery one would expect from Sanguinean royalty, a crisp royal blue coat emblazoned with gold trim and buttons over a starched white shirt and stiff black trousers. His eyes were a calm autumn brown, no trace of his wolf's gold as he swept in to meet Kirill and Irina. Loup clung to his arm, her blue eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. The silver dress she wore looked like it could have been stitched together from moonlight. It swayed around her legs as she moved, glittering in the fire's glow.
"Irina, it's a pleasure to see you again."
Etienne bowed.
"You remember my wife, Loup?"
"Of course, and it's so lovely to see you again."
Irina smiled at Loup.
"How are the pups?"
Loup straightened at the mention of her adopted pups, a smile lighting up her beautiful face.
"Growing like weeds. I think it's all the dresses they eat."
"I told you we need to start keeping them out of the castle,"
Etienne muttered.
"The tailor's going to stitch them to the furniture if they destroy one more of his creations."
The smile on Loup's face twisted, became a little less pleasant. A hint of gold swam behind her eyes.
"If he lays so much as a finger on them, I'll eat him."
Kirill arched an eyebrow at Etienne. The werewolf tucked his wife's hand more securely into the crook of his arm and shrugged.
"He's been warned before," he said simply.
Prince Adonis and Princess Ivy of Nyssa.
The werewolf couple moved on, and Kirill offered a small bow to the next arrivals. Adonis and Ivy were dressed like twin flames, the demon in a vibrant red tunic with a gold sash fastened at the shoulder with a large fire opal, and his sun-elemental bride gowned in silk that mimicked a waterfall of molten gold. Ivy's long hair was braided and looped over and over until it scarcely dragged on the floor at all. The couple had eyes only for one another, and didn't seem to notice the way Kirill froze when he saw their hands. Specks of paint were embedded in their fingernails, green, red, silver, and gold. Kirill flashed back to the images the second ghost had shown him.
"I've met Irina Adonis. She's much too friendly and outgoing to be content with a husband who doesn't care about her friends. Are you all right?"
Irina's voice ripped him from the memory in time for Kirill to smooth his face into a welcoming smile. If his nerves were a little frazzled, there was no need for anyone else to know.
"Yes,"
he whispered. He bowed to Adonis and Ivy.
"So pleased you could join us this evening."
"So pleased you could join us," Adonis answered, clapping Kirill on the back. Kirill gritted his teeth against the demon's joviality, not missing the look the demon gave his wife.
"I wouldn't miss it,"
he said, trying to keep the strain from his voice. He glanced at Irina, cursing himself for the concern he saw in her eyes. He needed to pull himself together. The hauntings were over. It was time to move on. He brushed a curl of raven hair back from her face.
"I would not miss this chance to spend time with my wife."
He turned back to Adonis and Ivy.
"And our friends. It is Kaleida, after all, is it not?"
Adonis's lips parted, and he blinked. He stood there, staring at Kirill, until Ivy cleared her throat and jabbed him in the side with her elbow.
"Darling, since your mouth is already open, why don't we go put some food in it?"
Ivy suggested wryly. Kirill nodded.
Help yourself, please. Isai has bespelled the banquet table to keep the food warm, and I'm assured everything is delicious. Prince Patrizio and Princess Marcella of Meropis and Atlantia. Ivy dragged Adonis towards the banquet tables as Patrizio and Marcella took their place in front of Kirill and Irina. Kirill was pleased to note that the angel was dressed in one of the outfits Kirill's personal tailor had designed. He knew the stark white tunic had special fastenings in the back that allowed it to be put on around the angel's wings, but the yards and yards of cerulean blue fabric that formed the cape spilling down the prince's back hid them nicely. The cape was fastened at either shoulder with silver brooches, each one bearing an emerald with a blue flame dancing in its center. The emeralds matched the dress wrapped around Marcella, the green silk a perfect accompaniment to her eyes. Something about the material shimmered, putting Kirill in mind of the mermaid tail that had once been the lower half of Marcella's body. He took a step back, trying to ease the angle of his neck as he gazed up at Patrizio. "Patrizio, you're looking well." The angel bowed.
As are you.
He smiled at Irina.
Irina, you look stunning. What did Kirill ever do to deserve you?
Irina waved a hand, humor tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I've always had a charitable nature." Marcella snickered behind her hand. Kirill slanted a glance at his wife, and Irina blinked at him innocently. "Indeed," Kirill murmured. "Prince Samel and Princess Ayana of Mu." Patrizio offered a final bow to Kirill and Irina. Then he and Marcella moved to join the others next to the banquet table. A ripple of power washed over Kirill, making every nerve in his body spasm with awareness. He drew himself together, keeping his face free of any signs of discomfort as the god and goddess moved to stand before him. The power rolling off the couple was stifling, like the air in the midst of an electrical storm. Samal's dark eyes were not the drowning pits that they'd been last night, but there was no mistaking his gaze for human either. The plain black pants and unadorned grey tunic he wore did nothing to mute the awing effect of his presence. Beside him, Ayana smiled, her eyes kind, though difficult to look upon with the way there always seemed to be something moving behind the ebony orbs. Green vines twined through her sable hair, sliding down her neck and teasing the sleeves of her red velvet gown. She perfumed the air around her with the scent of roses, but nothing could overwhelm the aroma of blood that followed the deities wherever they went.
Kirill, it is most rewarding to see you here celebrating with your wife.
Samal met Kirill's eyes, a knowing look on the god's face.
It's important to realize life is about more than work, is it not?
Kirill's fangs ached, the scent of blood sharpening his hunger even amidst the discomfort of facing the god again so soon. It seemed like only moments ago the god had been the vessel of the ghost of Kaleida Future, and the images he'd shown Kirill were far too powerful to be forgotten so quickly. It took him a moment to find his voice. "Well said, Samel. I'm pleased the two of you could make it."
We wouldn't miss it for the world,
Ayana assured him. A thick green vine tipped with delicate thorns curled down her arm, twitching in Kirill's direction. He fought to remain calm despite the nearly overwhelming urge to reach for the dagger in his waistband. Ayana meant no harm. The vines were merely an extension of her power, moving without conscious thought on her part. Still. "King Risi of the Altai Mountains." Samal's eyebrows shot up to his hairline, and Irina jerked so hard her hand slid from the crook of Kirill's arm. She stared at the entrance to the dining hall, blinking at the sight of the Troll King standing there in all his gold-bedecked finery.
The Dacian royal castle had been built to intimidate. Its large doorways meant to make those entering feel small, vulnerable. For the Troll King it was precisely the right size, allowing the behemoth monarch to enter the room without bowing his 9-foot frame. The muscles that bulged from his arms were constricted by thick leather bands, ornamented with gold that gleamed against his stone-colored skin, giving the impression of a creature that would glitter as he crushed to death anyone foolish enough to annoy him.
Kirill?
Irina blinked at him, seemingly at a loss for words.
He is your friend, is he not?
Kirill allowed himself a small smile at the shock on Irina's face.
Interesting,
Sarmal murmured.
Kirill, you continue to amaze.
Sarmal and Ayana moved off, and King Risi strolled to stand in front of Kirill. Kirill bowed deeply to the king.
Welcome, King Risi.
I must say, Prince Kirill,
Risi mused, his craggy voice booming through the room like a thunderclap.
I was most intrigued to get your invitation, but far be it from me to refuse an opportunity to see this lovely lady again.
He held his hands out, and Irina put her small hands in the Troll King's palms, a brilliant smile on her face.
You are too kind as always, Your Majesty.
Skoll is most eager to see you as well.
King Risi glanced at the buffet table and pressed his lips into a thin line.
Though, as usual, he is seeing to his stomach first.
Irina followed the king's stare and laughed at the sight of the Troll King's right-hand man piling a plate high with enough meat to feed an army. She patted Kirill's arm.
Darling, I'm going to go greet my friend, if that's all right.
Go,
Kirill urged her, Irina's smile easing the strain creeping over him.
Welcome your friend.
As soon as Irina had gone, the air between Kirill and King Risi chilled. Kirill slowly drew his composure together, resisting the urge to toy with his weapons beneath his cloak. He met the eyes of the Troll King, who was watching him like a hawk that spotted an interesting shadow moving on the forest floor.
Have we arrived at the part of the evening where you tell me why you really invited me here, Your Highness?
King Risi asked, his voice low and still grating.
You are wise to question the invitation,
Kirill answered calmly.
Though not, perhaps, for the reasons you might think.
He met the Troll King's eyes, careful not to make any sudden movements.
I want to extend an offer to you, an opportunity to sever our contract.
The king's eyes went dead, the muscle in his jaw twitching.
What are you up to, Kirill?
He growled.
Did you invite me here to attack? Have you so little respect for your wife that you would—
I have no intention of doing anything my wife would find disturbing,
Kirill interrupted evenly.
And nothing would please me more than for our contract to remain in place.
He drew himself up, holding his goal clearly in his mind.
However, I have had time to reconsider the circumstances under which you signed the contract.
Ah, yes. Irina was injured while visiting my kingdom, and you made it clear, in your Majesty's most subtle way, that if I did not sign your contract, you would use Irina's injury as an excuse to declare war.
The Troll King's eyes flashed.
I remember.
Kirill's fingers itched to wrap around his dagger, the need to be holding a weapon growing with every twitch of the Troll King's eyes. He held an image of Irina in his mind, letting the memory of that last horrible dream touch him again. The despair at losing Irina, the horror of watching the life fade from her body strengthened his resolve. That future would never come to pass, not if he could stop it. Irina once told me that I should concentrate on making friends instead of acquiring political allies. Kirill allowed himself a small smile. You and I both know that the two are not the same. When one's people and interests are threatened, it is the political ally that is most desirable.
Is it?
King Risi smirked.
From what I've heard, it seems your friends are precisely the ones who came to your aid when you needed it, and you to theirs.
Kirill paused, startled into silence. Slowly he slid his glance over to the other princes and their wives, watching them laughing and talking amongst themselves. It was true, he realized. In his time of need, it had been Etienne, Adonis, Patrizio, and Sarmal who'd come to his aid, not the creatures he had contracts with, but these men, who at the time had had little reason to like him or trust him. For Kirill, there had been practical reasons behind his decision to help when the other princes had needed it, but he doubted that had been true for the others.
Your Majesty, could I possibly be correct in deducing that what you're trying to tell me is that you wish me to sign a contract to be your ally, not because you have manipulated me into it, but because you wish us to be friends?
Hearing the words out loud made them sound foolish, even more so than they had already seemed. Kirill stared at Risi, at a loss for words. The dreams had frightened him. They'd made him reconsider his choices, but in the end they were all emotion. There was no logic. How could a strategy be built on such a flimsy foundation? What had he been thinking?
The vampire prince at a loss for words.
The Troll King's voice was soft, his eyebrows rising as he reconsidered Kirill.
I would not have believed that even Irina could inspire such a change in the dead prince.
Undead, Kirill murmured absently, his mind still whirring.
We are not friends, Kirill, because we do not like each other. I will consider what you've said about the contract. For now, I'm willing to let it stand.
The Troll King began to turn away, then paused. He glanced back at Kirill.
Irina loves you very much. For her sake, I will offer you a piece of insight.
Kirill frowned, distracted by his utter failure to think this conversation through before it had happened. Yes?
Friendship is not a duty or an asset. Forming one and maintaining one are not things to be added to your to-do list and checked off. You will be able to make friends only when you decide you want them, not need them, but want them.
He nodded in the direction of the other royalty.
Perhaps you should take this opportunity to discover if you like having friends. Perhaps then you will know whether this new pursuit has a prayer of working.
A sudden ruckus at the door drew both Kirill and King Risi's attention. The dwarves had arrived, each of them carrying a barrel nearly as tall as his own body. Kirill narrowed his eyes. They've brought their own alcohol, haven't they? King Risi nodded.
Typical for a dwarf. To be entirely fair, it is unlikely what you have is to their taste, either in flavor or strength.
Kirill pressed his fingers to his temples. He had no doubt that the alcohol being heaved in his direction had been purchased with the gold he'd only just given them.
I do believe I hate Collider.
King Risi clapped a hand on his shoulder, nearly pounding Kirill out of his skin.
It is customary for one's family to make holiday gatherings miserable. Why do you think I'm here instead of home?
With a loud guffaw, the Troll King swaggered off to the buffet table, nodding to the dwarves as the little men dropped their barrels and surged around Irina. She squealed in delight and began hugging each of them in turn, her eyes as bright as polished obsidian. Kirill smiled, the weight of his conversation with the Troll King lifting, if only temporarily. Eventually he would need to consider what the monarch had said. More information. That's what he needed. Suddenly Kirill remembered something. He gestured for the doorman to come to him.
"Summon Demian,"
he said quietly.
"There is a dwarf here who is unwell. I want him to ascertain what the problem is as subtly as possible, and treat it as subtly as possible,"
he repeated. The doorman's face remained composed, not betraying a hint of surprise at Kirill's odd orders. Kirill nodded in appreciation, then stood there as the doorman left. A strange feeling of nervousness slid cold fingers up his spine, and he shifted uncomfortably.
Perhaps you should take this opportunity to discover if you like having friends.
The Troll King made making friends sound a great deal more complicated than Kirill had originally thought it would be. More time-consuming, impossible to pretend. If it was true, if one had to actually enjoy friendship in order to make friends, what did that mean for him? Kirill set his shoulders and made his way over to where Patrizio and Marcella stood chatting. The others had drifted towards the buffet table to load their plates while Irina greeted her other guests. Marcella smiled as he approached, and Patrizio straightened. "Patrizio, I was wondering if you would care to join me for a hunting expedition next week," Kirill offered, trying to keep his voice casual. Patrizio paused with a large turkey leg halfway to his mouth.
Hunting?
He tilted his head.
You're inviting me hunting?
Well, to make it properly interesting, there would be a few modifications, of course, Kirill amended. We would hinder ourselves with horses and boar spears. No fangs or wings permitted. Patrizio's eyebrows shot up.
Hunt like humans?
His tone had the cadence of someone trying out the idea, musing over the quaintness of it. Kirill nodded. I find it is very helpful for keeping one's senses sharp. It is never a good idea to rely on the advantage of preternatural strength and speed.
This is something you do for tactical training?
Kirill paused, trying to keep his frustration from his face. If friendship was always this difficult and involved this many questions, then perhaps he would be better off sticking to contracts. Yes, and also for entertainment. He cleared his throat. Would you care to join? The angel looked down at his wife. Marcella's eyebrows had inched toward her hairline at Kirill's invitation, but she shrugged at her husband. He slowly turned back to Kirill.
Yes.
He cleared his throat and visibly shook off his confusion.
Yes, I would.
Good. I will see you next week. I'll have a messenger contact you with specifics. Patrizio nodded, though he still seemed unsure what had just happened, and Kirill turned just in time to receive Irina as she half flew into his arms. Oh, Kirill, this is the most wonderful collider I've ever had. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her mouth to his. Heat flowed from her flesh to his as she put enough passion into the kiss to melt the last of Kirill's doubts. He banded his arms around her waist, holding her against him as he returned the kiss. By the time he pulled back, Collider didn't seem quite so miserable as all that.
"Happy Collider, Irina," he whispered. "Whatever happened to effect this change in you, husband?" Irina murmured. "Perhaps it's time you tell me about your dream."
Before Kirill could answer, a flurry of movement caught his eye. He glanced up to see Demyan in a corner arguing with Ivan. The healer was offering the dwarf a flagon, no doubt a potion to address whatever ill the healer had been able to find in the smaller creature. Ivan was glowering at Demyan, refusing the drink as he clutched his own mug in his fist.
"Demyan!"
Kirill called out, keeping his arms around Irina.
"I told you, that concoction is too powerful for a dwarf. Get our friend something with a little less bite."
Demyan blinked at Kirill, pausing as if suddenly unsure what to do. Ivan's eyes nearly bulged out of his head, fury twisting his face into a writhing mass of lines. Kirill repressed a smile as the dwarf snatched the drink from Demyan's hand and downed it in one gulp. He watched with interest as the dwarf's eyes teared over, and he pressed his lips into a thin line. To Ivan's credit, he didn't spit it out.
"My apologies, Ivan. I was obviously mistaken about your constitution."
The dwarf thrust his chin out, though he still didn't try to speak. Kirill guessed that the magic of the potion had given away the trick, but the dwarf would never admit it. He looked away, giving Ivan the respect of not fussing over him as the dwarf returned to his brothers and began quaffing as much beer as he could fit into his mug. His brothers were already 3 sheets to the wind, and now Adonis had joined them in what seemed to be some sort of holiday drinking song. Beer flew from their mugs as they thrust them about as they sang, sloshing foul-smelling alcohol all over the floor and spattering a good bit of the wall.
"Pierun, take them,"
Kirill muttered.
"Every one."
That was Dead to Begin With by Jennifer Blackstream. Read by Matt Addis.